In the dusty training grounds of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where the air shimmers with heat and testosterone runs thicker than motor oil, a quiet revolution was about to unfold. It was July 2019, and Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had just been assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division's Weapons Maintenance Unit. At 5'4", with her hair pulled back in regulation style, she walked into a world where she was immediately labeled, categorized, and dismissed. The seasoned soldiers saw her civilian clothes on that first day and made their assumptions. Support staff, desk jockey, someone who'd never held anything more dangerous than a stapler. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But Maria Rodriguez carried secrets in her calloused hands and stories in her steady gaze that would soon shatter every preconceived notion these battle-hardened soldiers held about what strength looked like, what expertise meant, and what it truly took to earn respect in one of the most elite military units in the world. The morning Maria walked into the weapons maintenance bay, Sergeant First Class Jake Morrison was holding court. Morrison was the kind of soldier who'd seen 3 tours in Afghanistan, had shrapnel scars mapping his forearms like twisted rivers, and could field strip an M4 carbine in his sleep. He was demonstrating his skills to a group of newer recruits, his thick fingers dancing across the weapon's components with practiced precision. 47 seconds, he announced, as the last piece clicked into place. That's how you do it, soldiers. When your life depends on your weapon, every second counts. The recruits nodded with the reverence typically reserved for war heroes, which Morrison undeniably was. That's when Maria Rodriguez approached. She'd been observing from the corner, taking mental notes, studying not just Morrison's technique, but the entire dynamic of the room. The way respect was earned here wasn't through credentials or certifications, it was through demonstration, through proving yourself under pressure, through showing that your hands could do what your mouth claimed they could. Impressive, Maria said, her voice carrying just enough volume to cut through the ambient noise of the maintenance bay. Morrison turned and, for the first time, really looked at her. He saw the civilian clothes, the lack of obvious military bearing, the slight build that seemed almost fragile in this environment of Kevlar and steel. Thanks, Morrison replied, but his tone carried that particular mixture of politeness and dismissal that civilians often received in military spaces. You with the new support staff? The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Support staff. It was a classification that immediately established hierarchy, that drew clear lines between those who fought and those who filed paperwork, between those who bled and those who processed the reports about the bleeding. Something like that, Maria replied, stepping closer to the disassembled rifle. Mind if I take a look? Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. It wasn't unusual for support staff to be curious about weapons. After all, they were surrounded by them daily. But there was something in Maria's approach, the way she moved around the table, the manner in which her eyes traced the weapon's components, that suggested more than casual interest. Sure, Morrison said, gesturing toward the rifle parts scattered across the maintenance mat. Though I should warn you, this isn't exactly point-and-click software. The comment drew chuckles from the assembled soldiers. It was the kind of casual condescension that support staff faced regularly, not malicious necessarily, but rooted in the assumption that technical military skills were the exclusive domain of combat personnel. Maria's response was to reach into her pocket and pull out a black cloth bandana. The gesture was so unexpected, so seemingly random, that the chuckling stopped. Morrison watched, confused, as she began folding the bandana with careful precision. "What's that for?" one of the recruits asked. "Just want to make sure I'm not cheating," Maria replied, and before anyone could ask what she meant, she tied the bandana around her eyes, creating a blindfold that blocked out all light. The maintenance bay fell silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the muffled sounds of training exercises from the adjacent buildings. Morrison looked at his fellow soldiers with an expression that mixed amusement with growing concern. Was this civilian about to embarrass herself? Spectacularly? Was she having some kind of breakdown? What exactly was happening here? Maria stood perfectly still for a moment, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then, with movements that seemed almost ritualistic in their deliberateness, she placed her hands on the edge of the maintenance table and leaned forward. "Time me," she said simply. Morrison glanced at his watch, more out of curiosity than any expectation that timing would matter. Whatever was about to happen, he was certain it would be over quickly, probably after the first fumbling attempt to locate the rifle's components. But as Maria's hands found the first piece of the disassembled M4, something shifted in the room's energy. Her fingers moved with a confidence that seemed impossible given her blindfolded state, locating components with precision that defied explanation. The trigger assembly, the bolt carrier group, the charging handle. Each piece found its proper place with mechanical certainty, as if Maria's hands possessed some innate knowledge of the weapon's architecture that transcended sight. Morrison's amusement began transforming into something else entirely. First confusion, then growing amazement, then the kind of stunned silence that accompanies witnessing something that shouldn't be possible, but undeniably is.
The soldiers gathered around the maintenance table watched in absolute silence as Maria's blindfolded hands continued their impossible dance across the rifle components. What they were witnessing defied everything they thought they knew about weapons expertise, about muscle memory, about the limitations of human capability under pressure. Morrison's eyes were locked on his watch, but his brain was struggling to process what the seconds were telling him. 20 seconds, 30, 35. At this pace, she was moving faster than most of his experienced soldiers could manage with full vision and optimal lighting. Maria's breathing remained steady, controlled, as if she were performing a meditation rather than a complex mechanical task. Her fingers traced each component with the delicate precision of a surgeon, but moved with the swift efficiency of someone who had performed this exact sequence thousands upon thousands of times. The bolt slid home with a satisfying click. The charging handle locked into position with mechanical certainty. 40 seconds, Morrison announced, his voice carrying a note of disbelief that he couldn't quite suppress. The rifle was complete, fully assembled, ready for inspection. But more than that, it looked perfect. Every component properly seated, every connection secure, every tolerance met with manufacturing precision. But Maria wasn't finished. Without pause, without the slightest hesitation that might indicate uncertainty or the need to mentally reset, her hands began moving again. This time, in reverse. The charging handle came free. The bolt carrier group emerged from the upper receiver like a steel snake being charmed from its basket. The trigger assembly separated with surgical precision. The soldiers watching had seen weapon disassembly performed thousands of times. It was as fundamental to military life as marching or saluting. But they had never seen it performed like this, with the fluid grace of choreographed movement, with the absolute confidence of someone who knew exactly where every component would be before their hands arrived there. "Jesus Christ," one of the recruits whispered, immediately earning a sharp look from Morrison. But even the sergeant first class couldn't bring himself to issue a reprimand. The reverence in the young soldier's voice felt entirely appropriate for what they were witnessing. Morrison looked down at his watch again. 55 seconds total. 55 seconds to completely disassemble and reassemble an M4 carbine while blindfolded, then reassemble it to military specifications. It was the kind of performance that belonged in military training videos, the kind of skill that special operations units bragged about in classified after-action reports. And it was being demonstrated by someone they had dismissed as support staff. Maria reached up and untied her blindfold, blinking slightly as her eyes readjusted to the fluorescent lighting of the maintenance bay. She took a round at the circle of stunned faces surrounding her, taking in their expressions of shock, confusion, and dawning respect. 55 seconds, Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. 55 goddamn seconds. Not bad, Maria replied, with the kind of understated confidence that only comes from someone who knows exactly how exceptional their performance has been. Though I've done it faster. The statement landed like a grenade in the middle of the maintenance bay. Faster? This woman, whom they had assumed was a civilian contractor or administrative assistant, was claiming she could improve on what they had just witnessed? Morrison set his watch again, this time with the focused intensity of someone who needed to know exactly how deep this rabbit hole went. "Show me," he said. Maria smiled. Not the polite, deferent smile that support staff typically offered to combat personnel, but the confident, almost predatory smile of someone who is about to demonstrate the full extent of their capabilities. She retied the blindfold, this time pulling it even tighter, ensuring that no trace of light could penetrate the black fabric. Then she cracked her knuckles in a gesture that seemed both casual and ritualistic, like a pianist preparing for a particularly challenging concerto. "Time me," she said again. Her hands found the reassembled rifle and began their work. But this time, there was a different quality to their movements. Where before there had been smooth precision, now there was explosive speed. Components flew apart with practiced efficiency, each piece guided to its designated position on the maintenance mat with the kind of spatial awareness that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. The upper receiver separated from the lower receiver with a metallic snap. The bolt carrier group emerged with pinpoint accuracy. The charging handle, the trigger assembly, the pistol grip, each component found its place as if guided by invisible threads connecting Maria's hands to some three-dimensional map that existed only in her mind. Morrison watched his watch with the fascination of someone witnessing a magic trick, except he knew that what he was seeing was pure skill, pure training, pure muscle memory developed through repetition that bordered on obsession. The disassembly was complete, but again, Maria didn't pause. Her hands immediately began the reverse process, rebuilding the weapon with movements that seemed to blur together, individual actions becoming a part of a continuous flow of mechanical expertise. Click, snap, slide, lock. Each sound marked another component finding its proper home in the weapon's architecture. Morrison's watch showed 8 seconds when Maria's hands stilled and she reached up to remove her blindfold. 8 seconds. 8 seconds to completely disassemble and reassemble a military assault rifle while blindfolded in front of an audience of trained soldiers who were now staring at her as if she had walked on water.
The maintenance bay had become a cathedral of silence. 8 seconds. The number hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that none of the soldiers were quite ready to process. Morrison looked down at his stopwatch, then back at the perfectly assembled rifle, then at Maria, who stood calmly beside the maintenance table as if she had just demonstrated how to tie a shoelace, rather than perform what might have been the most impressive display of weapons expertise any of them had ever witnessed. 8 seconds, Morrison said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally altered. 8 goddamn seconds. The recruits stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, their training manuals and confident assumptions about military hierarchy scattered like leaves in a hurricane. They had been taught that expertise came with rank, that skill correlated with combat experience, that the most dangerous people in any military unit were always the ones wearing the most stripes or carrying the most scars. Maria Rodriguez, in her civilian clothes and unassuming demeanor, had just obliterated every one of those assumptions with nothing more than her hands and 8 seconds of impossible precision. How? The question came from Private Collins, a 20-year-old recruit from Nebraska who had joined the Army believing that basic training had prepared him for anything. How is that even possible? Maria looked at him with something approaching sympathy. She remembered being 20, remembered thinking that the world operated according to clear rules and predictable hierarchies. She remembered believing that you could judge a person's capabilities by their appearance, their job title, their position in whatever organizational chart governed your particular slice of reality. Practice, she said simply. Lots and lots of practice. But Morrison, his military instincts finally overriding his shock, knew that practice alone couldn't explain what he had just witnessed. Practice could develop speed, could build muscle memory, could create impressive levels of proficiency. But what Maria had demonstrated transcended proficiency. It approached artistry. "Who are you?" he asked, and this time the question carried the weight of genuine respect rather than dismissive curiosity. "I mean, really, who are you?" Maria considered her answer carefully. She had learned over the years that revealing too much about her background could sometimes create more problems than it solved. Military personnel, particularly those in combat units, often had complicated relationships with specialists from other branches of the armed forces. Territorial instincts ran deep, and admitting to certain types of training could trigger defensive responses that made collaboration difficult. But these soldiers had just seen her work. They had witnessed her capabilities firsthand, and the respect in Morrison's voice suggested that whatever defensive instincts he might possess had been temporarily overwhelmed by professional admiration. "Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez," she said, extending her hand to Morrison. "12th Special Operations Command, weapons specialist, technical instructor, and..." She paused, deciding how much to reveal. "Occasional consultant for situations that require very specific skill sets." Morrison took her hand, noting the firm grip, the calluses that spoke of countless hours handling weapons and equipment. Special operations? That explained some things, though it raised just as many new questions. "Special operations," he repeated. "What kind of special operations?" Maria's smile carried just a hint of mystery. The kind where 8-second weapon disassembly isn't just showing off, it's a job requirement. The maintenance bay erupted in a buzz of conversation as the implications of her statement sank in. Special Operations Command encompasses some of the most elite units in the military. Delta Force, Army Rangers, Green Berets. Units where impossible skill sets weren't just encouraged, they were mandatory for survival. Collins, still struggling to process what he had witnessed, raised his hand as if he were in a classroom rather than a military facility. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how many times have you practiced that? The disassembly thing, I mean." Maria laughed, and the sound was warm, human, completely at odds with the almost supernatural demonstration they had just witnessed. "Honestly, I stopped counting somewhere around 50,000 repetitions, but that was years ago. 50,000 repetitions. The number hit the assembled soldiers like a physical blow. They were accustomed to military training, to repetition, to the endless drilling that built competence through muscle memory. But 50,000 repetitions of a single skill represented a level of dedication that bordered on obsessive. "Why?" Morrison asked. "I mean, I get that special ops requires high standards, but that level of practice, that's not just meeting requirements. That's something else entirely." Maria's expression grew serious, and for the first time since she had entered the maintenance bay, the soldiers saw something in her eyes that spoke of experiences beyond training, of situations where the difference between 8 seconds and 10 seconds meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Because," she said quietly, "when you're in a hostile environment, when everything has gone wrong, when the only thing standing between your team and disaster is your ability to repair or disable a weapon system in complete darkness, under enemy fire, 8 seconds isn't impressive. 8 seconds is survival." The maintenance bay fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different quality. It was the silence of recognition, of understanding that they were in the presence of someone's skills had been forged, not in the comfortable environment of training facilities, but in the crucible of real combat operations where failure meant death. Morrison nodded slowly. "What else can you do?"
Morrison's question hung in the air like a challenge, and Maria could see in his eyes the same hunger for knowledge that had driven her own relentless pursuit of perfection. It was the look of a professional soldier recognizing another professional, the moment when rank and assumptions fell away, and only competence mattered. "What else can I do?" Maria repeated, considering the question. Around her, the maintenance bay had taken on the atmosphere of a masterclass, with soldiers unconsciously arranging themselves in a semicircle as if they were about to witness something that would fundamentally change their understanding of what human capability looked like. She walked over to a different maintenance station, where a variety of weapons lay in different states of assembly and repair. Her hands moved over them like a pianist selecting which concerto to perform, finally settling on a weapon that made several of the soldiers intake breath sharply. An M249 squad automatic weapon. The saw, as it was commonly known, was a beast of a machine gun that could lay down sustained automatic fire at a rate of 750 rounds per minute. It was also one of the most complex weapon systems in the infantry arsenal, with components that required precise timing and adjustment to function properly. Even experienced soldiers approached saw maintenance with respect bordering on caution. "The saw is interesting," Maria said, running her fingers along the weapon's housing. "Most people think of it as just a big, dumb machine that sprays bullets, but it's actually a precision instrument. The timing has to be perfect, the headspace and timing have to be exactly right, or it becomes more dangerous to the person firing it than to the enemy." She looked around at the assembled soldiers, noting their expressions of intense concentration. These were people who understood that weapon malfunctions in combat weren't just inconveniences. They were potential death sentences. The standard military manual says it takes trained personnel 45 minutes to completely disassemble, clean, and reassemble a saw to military specifications. That's with full lighting, proper tools, and a clean environment. Morrison was beginning to understand where this demonstration was heading, and part of him wasn't sure he was ready for what Maria might be about to show them. 8 seconds for an M4 had been impressive enough to rewrite his understanding of human capability. If she was suggesting what he thought she was suggesting about the saw, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Maria began clearing a larger workspace, moving aside tools and components with the efficient movements of someone who had performed similar preparations countless times. But instead of reaching for her blindfold, she did something that made Morrison's blood pressure spike visibly. She began turning off the lights. One by one, the fluorescent fixtures went dark until the maintenance bay was illuminated only by the pale emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie red glow. It was the kind of lighting that made detailed mechanical work nearly impossible, the kind of conditions that would challenge even experienced technicians working on simple tasks. "Emergency lighting," Maria explained, her voice carrying clearly in the darkened space. "Because in the real world, you don't get to choose when your equipment fails or where you'll need to perform repairs." She returned to the saw, her movements confident despite the dramatically reduced visibility. The soldiers watched, their eyes straining in the dim red light, as she began the disassembly process. But this time, there was a narrative quality to her work. Instead of the silent efficiency she had displayed with the M4, she began talking, explaining each step, sharing the kind of knowledge that typically took years of experience to accumulate. "The key to speed isn't rushing," she said, her hands working steadily as components began separating from the main weapon system. "But it's understanding the logical flow of the disassembly. Every weapon is designed with an internal logic, a sequence that makes sense once you understand the engineering principles involved." The bolt assembly came free, followed by the operating rod, then the gas regulator. Each component was placed with precision despite the limited visibility, arranged on the maintenance mat in a pattern that would facilitate rapid reassembly. Most people approach weapon maintenance like they're performing surgery, very careful, very deliberate, checking and double-checking every step. But when you truly understand a weapon system, when you've internalized its mechanical logic, maintenance becomes more like playing a musical instrument. Your hands know where to go before your brain consciously directs them. Morrison checked his watch as Maria continued working.
10 minutes had passed and she had already disassembled components that would have taken him 20 minutes to remove in full lighting. But more impressive than her speed was the casual way she continued her explanation, as if complex mechanical disassembly in near darkness was no more challenging than tying her shoes. The real secret, she said, removing the last major component from the weapon system, is understanding that every weapon tells you what it needs. The resistance when you turn a bolt, the sound when components separate, the way metal feels when it's properly aligned. These are all forms of communication. The weapon is constantly giving you information about its condition and what it requires. She began the reassembly process, and now the soldiers could see the truth of her statement. Her movements weren't just fast, they were responsive. When a component required adjustment, her hands made micro-corrections without conscious direction. When resistance indicated improper alignment, she adjusted her approach before the problem could develop. The saw began taking shape again under her skilled touch, components flowing back into their proper positions with the inevitability of water finding its level.
23 minutes after Maria had begun her demonstration in the darkened maintenance bay, she stepped back from the completely reassembled M249 saw. The weapon sat on the maintenance table looking exactly as it had before she started, except now every soldier in the room understood that they had just witnessed something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about what human beings could accomplish under adverse conditions. Morrison flicked the lights back on, and the sudden illumination revealed something remarkable. Despite working in near darkness for over 20 minutes, despite handling dozens of precise components and making hundreds of minute adjustments, Maria's workspace was immaculate. Every tool was in its proper place, every spare component organized with military precision. It was as if she possessed some internal organizational system that functioned independently of external conditions. 23 minutes, Morrison announced, though his voice carried more awe than simple timekeeping. Complete disassembly, cleaning, and reassembly of a squad automatic weapon in emergency lighting conditions. I've seen master armorers take longer in perfect conditions. Maria nodded, accepting the compliment with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how exceptional their performance had been. But instead of basking in the admiration of the assembled soldiers, she used the moment to teach. The key insight, she said, running her hand along the reassembled weapon, is understanding that mechanical systems are essentially three-dimensional puzzles. Once you understand the puzzle's logic, once you can visualize how all the pieces fit together in your mind, external conditions become much less important. She looked around at the soldiers, noting their expressions of fascination mixed with the kind of professional hunger that drove military personnel to constantly improve their skills. But there's something else, she continued, something that goes beyond mechanical knowledge or manual dexterity. Collins, who had been following every word of Maria's explanation with the intensity of a religious convert, raised his hand tentatively. "What's that, ma'am?" "Pressure," Maria said simply. "All the mechanical knowledge in the world doesn't matter if you can't perform when everything is going wrong, when people are depending on you, when failure means catastrophic consequences." The maintenance bay fell silent as the implications of her statement sank in. These soldiers understood pressure. They trained constantly under artificially stressful conditions, preparing for combat situations where their skills would be tested under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. But they were beginning to understand that Maria's relationship with pressure was different, more intimate, forged through experiences they could only imagine. Morrison, his curiosity now completely overriding any residual skepticism, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Where did you learn all this? I mean, special operations training is intensive, but what you're demonstrating, this goes beyond what any training program could produce." Maria's expression grew thoughtful, and for a moment the soldiers saw past her confident exterior to something deeper. Memories of challenges that had pushed her beyond normal human limitations, experiences that had required her to develop skills that most people would consider impossible. "Afghanistan," she said quietly, 2017. Forward Operating Base Chapman, near the Pakistani border. The name carried weight among military personnel. Chapman was notorious for being one of the most dangerous assignments in the entire theater, an isolated outpost surrounded by hostile territory where supply lines were constantly under threat and conventional support was often impossible. My team was responsible for maintaining weapon systems for multiple units operating out of Chapman. Rangers, special forces, conventional infantry, everyone depended on us to keep their equipment functional under conditions that were challenging. She paused, searching for the right words. Morrison nodded, understanding the euphemism. Challenging in military parlance often meant deadly beyond civilian comprehension. The thing about Chapman was that everything broke. The desert conditions, the constant use, the dust that got into every mechanical system, we were constantly dealing with equipment failures that could get people killed if we didn't fix them immediately. She walked over to a window that looked out onto the training grounds, where soldiers were conducting routine exercises under bright Carolina sunshine. The contrast with the conditions she was describing seemed almost surreal. One night in August, we took indirect fire during a major operation. Mortars, rockets, the whole base was under attack. In the middle of the bombardment, 3 different units radioed in with critical weapon malfunctions. Squad weapons that had jammed, precision rifles with scope failures, machine gun systems that had stopped cycling properly. The soldiers listening could imagine the scene, explosions rocking the base, enemy fire incoming, and somewhere in the chaos, someone having to repair complex mechanical systems that other people's lives depended on. The thing was, Maria continued, there was no time to set up proper workspaces, no time to organize tools, no time to work methodically through maintenance procedures, and definitely no proper lighting. We were working in bunkers, by flashlight, with mortars landing close enough to shake dust off the walls. Collins swallowed hard, beginning to understand the context that had produced the skills they had been witnessing. "So you learned to work fast," Morrison said, though it wasn't really a question. "I learned that fast isn't fast enough," Maria replied. "I learned that when people are depending on you, when their lives are literally in your hands, you find capabilities you didn't know you possessed."
Maria's words hung in the air like smoke from a distant battlefield, and the soldiers in the maintenance bay began to understand that they weren't just witnessing exceptional technical skills. They were seeing the physical manifestation of experiences that had pushed human capability to its absolute limits. "How many nights like that were there?" Morrison asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 47, Maria replied without hesitation, the precision of the number suggesting that each incident was burned into her memory with perfect clarity. 47 times when equipment failures during combat operations required immediate field repair under hostile fire. She turned away from the window and looked directly at the assembled soldiers, and they could see in her eyes something that no amount of peacetime training could produce, the absolute certainty that comes from having your skills tested in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable. "Each incident taught me something," she continued. "The first few times, I was terrified. My hands shook. I dropped components. I made mistakes that could have gotten people killed. But terror is a luxury you can't afford when lives depend on your performance." Private Collins, who had been hanging on every word, asked quietly, "How do you get past the fear?" Maria smiled, and there was something almost maternal in her expression as she looked at the young soldier. "You don't get past it. You learn to work with it. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you focused on what matters. The trick is not letting it control your hands." She walked back to the maintenance table where the reassembled SAW sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. By the 10th incident, I could perform basic repairs while incoming fire was landing close enough to feel the shockwaves. By the 20th incident, I was working on complex systems in complete darkness while the base was under full assault. Morrison shook his head in amazement. "And by the 47th?" "By the 47th, Maria said,
her voice carrying a note of quiet pride. "I could completely disassemble, repair, and reassemble any weapon system in the Army inventory blindfolded in under 2 minutes, while mortars were landing close enough to spray dirt across my workspace." The maintenance bay fell silent as the soldiers processed the statement. They were trained warriors, accustomed to operating under stress, familiar with the adrenaline-fueled intensity of combat operations. But what Maria was describing transcended their experience entirely. 2 minutes, Morrison repeated, his voice barely audible, for any weapon system. "The M2 Browning .5 caliber machine gun," Maria said casually. 1 minute, 47 seconds. Complete field strip and reassembly. During a firefight that lasted 6 hours. She began walking around the maintenance bay, her hands trailing across various weapon systems as she spoke. The Mark 19 grenade launcher, 1 minute, 12 seconds, while taking indirect fire from enemy mortars. Her hands settled on an M240B machine gun mounted on a bipod in the corner. This beauty right here, 53 seconds, during a coordinated attack that involved rockets, small arms fire, and improvised explosive devices detonating close enough to feel the heat. The specificity of her recollections, the casual way she rattled off times that seemed impossible, created a cognitive dissonance among the listening soldiers. Part of them wanted to doubt what they were hearing, to dismiss it as exaggeration or military folklore. But they had seen her work. They had witnessed skills that matched her claims. Collins, his voice tight with something approaching reverence, asked, "Ma'am, how do you even train for something like that?" Maria's laugh was short and bitter. "You don't train for it, you survive it. And if you're lucky, if you're good enough, if you refuse to quit when every rational part of your brain is telling you to run, you discover capabilities you never knew you possessed." She moved to a different maintenance station where several partially disassembled weapons lay waiting for repair. Without conscious thought, her hands began working on a rifle that had clearly been giving someone trouble, correcting whatever issues had stymied the previous technician, with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. "The thing you have to understand," she said, continuing to work as she talked, "is that exceptional skill isn't really about natural talent or special gifts. It's about being placed in situations where anything less than exceptional performance means catastrophic failure." Morrison watched her hands as she spoke, noting how she addressed the rifle's mechanical issues with the same casual efficiency she might apply to buttering toast. "And you volunteered for 47 of those situations?" "I didn't volunteer for them," Maria replied, her voice carrying a note of hard-earned wisdom. "They volunteered for me. When you're the best at something, when people know they can depend on your skills under any conditions, you become the person they call when normal solutions aren't enough." The rifle she had been working on clicked together with a sound of mechanical satisfaction, completely repaired and ready for use. She set it aside and looked around at the assembled soldiers with an expression that mixed professional assessment with genuine warmth. "Which brings me to why I'm here."
Maria's statement, "which brings me to why I'm here," created a shift in the atmosphere of the maintenance bay. The soldiers who had been caught up in the amazing demonstration of her skills suddenly remembered that exceptional personnel didn't usually appear at routine training facilities without specific purposes. Morrison's expression grew more serious as his military instincts kicked in, recognizing that what had begun as an impressive skills demonstration might actually be something much more significant. "You're not just here for routine assignment, are you?" Morrison asked, though the question was more statement than inquiry. Maria shook her head, and for the first time since entering the maintenance bay, her casual demeanor gave way to something more formal, more mission-oriented.
3 weeks ago, intelligence reports began indicating unusual activity at several overseas locations where American military equipment has been captured or abandoned over the years. She moved to a wall-mounted map that showed various global regions marked with different colored pins. Morrison and the other soldiers followed, their attention now completely focused on what was clearly becoming a briefing rather than a casual conversation. The intelligence suggests that hostile forces have been attempting to reverse engineer American weapons systems, with particular focus on our most advanced infantry weapons and crew-served systems, Maria continued, pointing to several locations on the map. Syria, Afghanistan, parts of Africa where equipment was left behind during rapid evacuations. Collins raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, isn't that something intelligence agencies would handle, or special operations units? Maria nodded approvingly at the question. Excellent point, Private, and normally you'd be absolutely correct. But this situation has some unique characteristics that require a very specific skill set. She walked to a secure briefcase that had been sitting unnoticed in the corner of the maintenance bay, entering a combination that caused several electronic locks to disengage with soft clicking sounds. From inside, she withdrew a series of photographs that she began arranging on the maintenance table. These images were captured by reconnaissance assets over the past 2 weeks, she said, her voice taking on the clinical tone of a military briefer. What you're looking at are workshops, sophisticated facilities where our captured equipment is being systematically analyzed and reverse engineered. Morrison leaned over the photographs. His experienced eye immediately recognized the implications of what he was seeing. The images showed large, well-organized spaces filled with disassembled American weapons, technical equipment for measuring and analyzing components, and what appeared to be prototype manufacturing capabilities. They're not just trying to figure out how our weapons work, he said, his voice grim. They're trying to manufacture their own versions. Exactly, Maria confirmed, but here's where it gets interesting. Intelligence indicates that they've been partially successful with some systems, but completely stymied by others. The weapons they can't crack share certain characteristics. She pulled out another set of photographs, these showing close-up images of specific weapon components. Complex timing mechanisms, precision-engineered tolerances, systems that require not just understanding of the mechanical principles, but intimate knowledge of manufacturing processes and assembly techniques. The soldiers studied the images, beginning to understand the scope of the problem. If hostile forces could successfully reverse engineer American weapons systems, they would gain access to military capabilities that had taken decades and billions of dollars to develop. The question, Maria continued, is how to prevent them from succeeding. Traditional approaches, airstrikes, special operations raids, cyber warfare, all have significant limitations and political complications. She looked around at the assembled soldiers, gauging their understanding. But there's another approach, one that requires someone who understands these weapon systems better than the people trying to reverse engineer them. Morrison's eyes widened as he began to understand what Maria was suggesting. You're talking about sabotage, but not conventional sabotage, technical sabotage. Someone who could get into these facilities and damage the research in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious. More than that, Maria said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had already thought through every aspect of a complex plan. Someone who could introduce subtle flaws into their reverse engineering process. Someone who could make their copied weapons appear to function properly during testing, but fail catastrophically under combat stress. The implications of what she was describing began to sink in among the listening soldiers. It wasn't just about preventing hostile forces from copying American weapons. It was about turning their reverse engineering efforts into a weapon against them. Collins, his voice tight with fascination and horror, asked, "How would something like that even work?" Maria smiled, and there was something almost predatory in her expression. Let me give you an example. Say you're reverse engineering an M4 carbine. You disassemble it, measure every component, analyze the metallurgy, study the manufacturing processes. You think you understand how it works. She moved to one of the M4s on the maintenance table, her hands moving over its components as she spoke. But there are dozens of subtle design elements that aren't immediately obvious. tolerances that seem arbitrary but are actually critical for reliability, heat treatment processes that affect metal properties in ways that only become apparent after thousands of rounds. Her fingers traced specific components as she continued. Someone with intimate knowledge of these systems could introduce flaws that would be virtually undetectable during normal inspection, but would cause catastrophic failures under combat stress. Morrison was beginning to understand the full scope of what Maria was proposing. You could make their copied weapons more dangerous to them than to their enemies. Exactly, Maria confirmed, but it would require someone who could infiltrate these facilities, work undetected among their technical teams, and introduce precise sabotage that wouldn't be discovered until it was too late. She pulled out one final photograph, this one showing a detailed layout of one of the reverse engineering facilities. The largest and most advanced of these operations is located in a mountainous region of Syria, disguised as a manufacturing facility for agricultural equipment. Intelligence estimates that they're within months of successfully replicating several critical American weapon systems. The maintenance bay fell silent as the soldiers processed the magnitude of what they were hearing. This wasn't just about impressive technical skills or military history. This was about an active mission that could have significant implications for American military superiority worldwide. "And you're going to infiltrate this facility?" Morrison said, though again it was more statement than question. Maria nodded. "The mission requires someone who can blend in with technical personnel, who can understand complex weapon systems well enough to sabotage them effectively, and who can work under extreme pressure without making mistakes that would compromise the operation." She looked around at the assembled soldiers, her expression serious but confident. The 8-second rifle disassembly isn't just a party trick. It's a job requirement. When you're working in a hostile facility, surrounded by people who would kill you without hesitation if they discovered your real purpose, you need to be able to work faster and more precisely than anyone around you.
The weight of Maria's revelation settled over the maintenance bay like a heavy blanket. The soldiers found themselves looking at her with new eyes, understanding that they weren't just in the presence of someone with exceptional technical skills, but someone who is about to undertake one of the most dangerous infiltration missions imaginable. Morrison, his military training asserting itself, began thinking through the tactical implications. How do you even get into a facility like that? I assume they don't just post job openings on LinkedIn? Maria's laugh was short and humorless. Actually, they do something remarkably similar. The facility poses as a legitimate agricultural equipment manufacturer, and they've been actively recruiting technical personnel with specific skill sets. Weapons expertise, precision manufacturing, metallurgical analysis, all skills that translate perfectly to agricultural equipment production. She pulled out another document from her briefcase, this one showing what appeared to be a standard employment advertisement translated into English. 6 months ago, intelligence assets began establishing a cover identity for me. Maria Santos, a technical specialist with experience in precision manufacturing, recently laid off from a defense contractor due to budget cuts. Collins studied the advertisement, noting how innocuous it appeared. And they actually believe that story? Cover identities aren't just about having the right paperwork. They're about having the right skills to back up your supposed background. When I walk into that facility and demonstrate that I can outperform their existing technical staff, they won't question my credentials. They'll be grateful to have found someone so capable. Morrison nodded slowly, beginning to understand the elegance of the approach. You're not trying to sneak in. You're making them want to recruit you. Exactly. The best infiltrations are the ones where the target organization actively helps you gain access to exactly what you need. Maria moved back to the maintenance table, her hands unconsciously straightening the tools and components as she spoke. But once I'm inside, the real challenge begins. She looked around at the assembled soldiers, gauging their understanding. These aren't amateur bomb makers working in cave workshops. The facility employs some genuinely skilled engineers and technicians, people who understand weapon systems well enough to spot obvious sabotage, who would notice if equipment suddenly stopped working for no apparent reason. The soldiers exchanged glances, beginning to appreciate the complexity of what Maria was describing. It wasn't enough to simply damage equipment. The sabotage had to be sophisticated enough to escape detection by competent professionals. So, how do you sabotage something without anyone noticing? Collins asked. Maria smiled, and there was something almost educational in her expression, as if she were about to explain a particularly elegant solution to a complex problem. The key is understanding that every mechanical system has failure modes, ways it can break that appear to be the result of normal wear, manufacturing defects, or operational stress rather than deliberate sabotage. She picked up one of the rifle components from the maintenance table, holding it up to catch the light. Take this bolt carrier group, for example. It's precisely machined to very tight tolerances. If those tolerances are off by even fractions of a millimeter, the weapon will appear to function normally during testing, but will fail under rapid fire conditions. Morrison leaned forward, his technical curiosity overriding his concerns about operational security. And you can introduce those kinds of flaws without anyone noticing? Better than that, Maria replied. I can introduce flaws that actually improve short-term performance while creating long-term failure modes. Imagine a weapon that shoots more accurately during initial testing because of slight modifications to the barrel harmonics, but develops stress fractures that cause catastrophic failure after a few hundred rounds. The implications of what she was describing began to sink in among the listening soldiers. It wasn't just about making weapons malfunction. It was about creating weapons that would fail at the worst possible moment for their users. The beauty of this approach, Maria continued, is that it turns their reverse engineering process into a weapon against them. Every successful prototype they produce becomes a potential casualty-causing device for their own forces. Collins, his voice carrying a note of awe, said, That's brilliant and terrifying. It's necessary, Maria replied, her tone becoming more serious. These reverse engineering efforts represent a genuine threat to American military superiority. If hostile forces can successfully copy our most advanced weapon systems, they gain access to capabilities that took us decades to develop. She moved to the wall map again, pointing to various locations marked with colored pins. But more than that, they can potentially develop countermeasures for our existing weapons. Understanding how something works is the first step towards defeating it. Morrison studied the map, noting the global scope of the threat. How many facilities like this are there? Intelligence has identified at least 12 major operations worldwide. The Syrian facility is the largest and most advanced, but there are similar efforts in multiple countries. This mission is essentially a proof of concept. If we can successfully sabotage the Syrian operation, we can potentially replicate the approach at other facilities. The maintenance bay fell silent as the soldiers processed the global implications of what they were hearing. This wasn't just about a single mission or a single facility. It was about a new type of warfare being conducted in workshops and laboratories rather than on traditional battlefields. When do you deploy? Morrison asked quietly. Maria checked her watch, and for the first time, the soldiers noticed something almost vulnerable in her expression, a brief glimpse of the human being beneath the supreme professional competence. 72 hours, she said. Transport to a staging area in Jordan, then infiltration through established refugee networks. The timeline is tight because intelligence indicates they're approaching breakthrough moments with several weapon systems.
The reality of Maria's timeline, 72 hours, created a palpable shift in the maintenance bay's atmosphere. What had begun as an impressive demonstration of technical skills had evolved into something much more immediate and consequential. Morrison found himself looking at Maria with the kind of respect typically reserved for soldiers heading into combat operations, because that's exactly what she was. 72 hours, Morrison repeated, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that such timelines usually meant the difference between mission success and strategic failure. That's not much time for final preparations. Maria nodded, and the soldiers could see her mental state beginning to shift from instructor to operator, from someone sharing knowledge to someone preparing for an extremely dangerous mission. The infiltration plan has been in development for months, but the timeline accelerated when intelligence reported significant progress at the Syrian facility. She moved back to her briefcase, withdrawing what appeared to be technical manuals and detailed schematics. These are the weapon systems they're currently prioritizing for reverse engineering: M4A1 carbines, M249 SAWs, M240B machine guns, and most concerning, the M107A1 50 caliber sniper system. Collins whistled low at the mention of the M107A1. Even soldiers with limited sniper experience understood that weapon's capabilities: effective range beyond 1,800 meters, ability to disable vehicles and equipment, precision that could change the outcome of entire engagements. If they successfully copy the M107A1, Maria continued, they gain access to precision long-range capabilities that could threaten American forces across multiple theaters of operation. More importantly, they could potentially export that technology to other hostile organizations. Morrison studied the schematics, noting the incredible complexity of the systems Maria would need to understand well enough to sabotage effectively. How do you memorize all of this? I mean, the technical details for all these different weapon systems. Maria's smile carried a hint of something that might have been pride mixed with exhaustion. You don't memorize it, you internalize it. You study until the mechanical relationships become intuitive, until you can visualize how every component interacts with every other component, until the weapons become extensions of your own understanding. She picked up one of the M4 carbines from the maintenance table, her hands moving over its components as she spoke. Every weapon tells a story about the engineering decisions that created it, the manufacturing processes that built it, the design philosophy that shaped it. When you truly understand that story, you can rewrite the ending. The metaphor wasn't lost on the assembled soldiers. Maria wasn't just talking about mechanical sabotage. She was describing a form of technical warfare that required understanding systems well enough to turn them against themselves. But there's another element to this mission that makes it particularly challenging, Maria continued, her expression growing more serious. The facility isn't just reverse engineering American weapons. Intelligence indicates they're also developing countermeasures, ways to defeat our existing systems. She pulled out another set of photographs, these showing what appeared to be testing equipment and ballistic analysis stations. They're firing captured American ammunition against various armor configurations, studying penetration patterns, analyzing metallurgy of our projectiles. They're essentially conducting the same research and development that we do, but with the goal of defeating our advantages rather than maintaining them. Morrison felt a chill as he understood the implications. They're not just trying to copy our weapons, they're trying to make our weapons ineffective. Exactly, Maria confirmed, which means this mission isn't just about sabotage, it's about intelligence gathering. I need to understand what countermeasures they're developing so we can adapt our own systems accordingly. The dual nature of her mission added another layer of complexity that the soldiers were still processing. Infiltration, sabotage, and intelligence gathering, all while maintaining a cover identity that would fool competent professionals. It was the kind of mission that seemed almost impossible, except they had seen Maria's capabilities firsthand. Collins, his voice tight with concern, asked, "Ma'am, what happens if they figure out who you really are?" Maria's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she had considered that possibility extensively. The facility is located in hostile territory, surrounded by organizations that consider Americans legitimate targets. Discovery would mean immediate execution, probably after interrogation designed to extract information about American capabilities and intelligence assets. The matter-of-fact way she described her potential fate created a sobering silence in the maintenance bay.
These soldiers were accustomed to dangerous missions, but they typically involved conventional military operations with established support networks and extraction protocols. What Maria was describing was pure solo infiltration with no backup and no safety net. "Why you?" asked Morrison quietly. "I mean, you're obviously incredibly skilled, but this seems like the kind of mission that would require a full team of specialists." Maria looked around at the assembled soldiers, and they could see her considering how much to reveal about the operational reasoning behind her selection. Multiple specialists create multiple opportunities for discovery. Different people have different mannerisms, different knowledge gaps, different tells that trained observers can detect. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But more than that, this mission requires someone who can outperform everyone else in the facility so completely that their expertise becomes unquestionable. When you're the best at something, people stop examining your credentials and start asking for your advice. The elegance of the approach was becoming clear to Morrison. Instead of trying to blend in as an average technician, Maria would establish herself as an exceptional one, using her skills as both camouflage and access key. "And if someone is suspicious anyway?" Collins asked. Maria's smile was thin but confident. "Then I demonstrate capabilities that make suspicion irrelevant. It's hard to question someone's loyalty when they've just solved problems that have been stumping your entire technical team."
As the reality of Maria's mission continued to sink in, Morrison found himself grappling with questions that went beyond military tactics and technical capabilities. He was looking at someone who possessed skills that bordered on the superhuman, who was about to undertake a mission that could affect global military balance, and who discussed the possibility of torture and execution with the same casual professionalism that others might discuss weather forecasts. "Can I ask you something personal?" Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity mixed with concern. Maria nodded, though her expression suggested she was accustomed to deflecting questions that probed too deeply into her psychological state. "How do you do it?" Morrison continued. "I mean, how do you prepare mentally for something like this? How do you maintain the kind of focus necessary for a mission where the slightest mistake means death?" For the first time since entering the maintenance bay, Maria's composed exterior showed a crack of something more human, more vulnerable. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands unconsciously adjusting tools on the maintenance table as she considered her response. "You compartmentalize," she said finally. "You divide your mind into sections, the section that worries, the section that plans, the section that performs. You train the performance section until it can function independently of everything else." She looked around at the assembled soldiers, noting their expressions of intense concentration. "But more than that, you develop a relationship with fear that most people would consider unhealthy. You learn to use fear as a tool, rather than letting it use you." Collins, his voice barely above a whisper, asked, "How?" Maria's smile was slight but genuine. "Fear sharpens focus. Fear heightens awareness. Fear makes you more careful, more precise, more committed to getting every detail exactly right. The trick is learning to surf the fear instead of being overwhelmed by it." She moved to the window again, looking out at the training grounds where soldiers were conducting routine exercises under bright sunlight. "Every time I perform that 8-second rifle disassembly, I'm not just demonstrating technical skill. I'm proving to myself that I can maintain absolute precision under any conditions." Morrison began to understand the deeper purpose behind the seemingly endless practice she had described. It wasn't just about developing muscle memory, it was about creating psychological certainty that her hands would perform correctly regardless of external circumstances. "But there's something else," Maria continued, turning back to face the soldiers. "Something that goes beyond individual preparation." She gestured toward the assembled group, her expression growing more serious. "Every American soldier who deploys overseas, every person who puts on a uniform and accepts the responsibility of defending this country is part of a larger system. You're all counting on the weapons on them."
The soldiers nodded, understanding the fundamental truth of her statement. Military effectiveness depended not just on individual courage and training, but on the reliability of the tools and systems that supported those individuals. The weapons being reverse-engineered in that Syrian facility aren't just threats to American military superiority, they're threats to every soldier who might face them in combat, every family member waiting for someone to come home safely, every civilian whose security depends on American military capabilities. Morrison found himself nodding, beginning to understand the broader context that drove someone to accept the kind of mission Maria was preparing for. It wasn't just about technical sabotage or intelligence gathering, it was about protecting the people who depended on American military effectiveness. So when I walk into that facility in 72 hours, Maria continued, I won't be carrying just my own skills and training. I'll be carrying the responsibility to ensure that the weapons our soldiers depend on maintain their reliability advantage, and that the weapons our enemies might acquire become liabilities rather than assets. The maintenance bay fell silent as the soldiers processed the full scope of what they had learned. They had witnessed skills that redefined their understanding of human capability, learned about threats that challenged their assumptions about global security, and met someone who embodied a level of dedication that most people couldn't comprehend. Collins, his voice carrying a note of admiration mixed with concern, asked, "Is there anything we can do? I mean, to help with the mission or support you somehow?" Maria's expression softened, and for a moment the soldiers saw past her professional competence to something more personal. You can remember what you've seen here today. You can understand that exceptional capability exists, that there are people willing to undertake impossible missions to protect the things that matter. She looked around at each of the assembled soldiers, making eye contact with each one. And you can continue developing your own skills, pushing your own capabilities, because the world is a dangerous place that requires exceptional people to stand between civilization and chaos. Morrison straightened slightly, unconsciously coming to attention. "Ma'am, if you ever need anything, backup, support, whatever, you just let us know." Maria smiled, and there was genuine warmth in her expression. "I'll remember that, Sergeant. I'll remember all of you." As she began packing her briefcase, preparing to leave for whatever final preparations awaited her, the soldiers understood that they had been part of something significant, not just a demonstration of remarkable skills, but a glimpse into the kind of sacrifice and dedication that operated behind the scenes of global security. 6 months later, Morrison was conducting routine maintenance training when his secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. The sender was listed simply as MR, but he knew immediately who it was. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the message, remembering the woman who had walked into their maintenance bay and changed everything they thought they knew about human capability. The message was brief. Mission complete. Package delivered. Secondary objectives achieved. Thank you for the reminder that exceptional people make the impossible possible. Morrison stared at the screen for a long moment, then called Collins over. The young private had been different since Maria's visit. More focused, more dedicated to perfecting his technical skills, more aware that somewhere in the world, people like her were risking everything to protect people like him. "She did it," Morrison said simply, showing Collins the message. Collins read it twice, then looked up with an expression that mixed relief with awe. "The Syrian facility?" "All of it," Morrison confirmed. "The sabotage, the intelligence gathering, everything." What Morrison didn't know, what couldn't be included in any encrypted message, was the full scope of what Maria had accomplished during her 6 months undercover. She had not only successfully infiltrated the facility, but had been promoted to lead technician within 3 weeks, her demonstrated expertise making her invaluable to their reverse engineering efforts. Working 18-hour days, she had systematically introduced flaws into every weapon system they were attempting to copy. Microscopic stress points in metal components that would cause catastrophic failures under combat conditions. Timing mechanisms adjusted by fractions of seconds that would create dangerous malfunctions during sustained fire.
Manufacturing processes subtly altered to produce components that appeared perfect but contain inherent weaknesses. But more than that, she had identified 12 other similar facilities worldwide, documented their research priorities, and provided intelligence that would allow American forces to develop countermeasures against their countermeasures. She had turned their entire reverse engineering program into an intelligence gathering operation that benefited American military capabilities. The extraction had been the most dangerous part of the mission. When facility security began investigating production inconsistencies that couldn't be explained by normal manufacturing tolerances, Maria had known her time was running out. She had 48 hours to transfer the final intelligence data and disappear before their investigation led them to her. The 8-second rifle disassembly that had amazed Morrison and his soldiers had literally saved her life. When security forces surrounded the facility during her final night, she had been forced to disable 6 weapons simultaneously to prevent pursuit. Working in complete darkness, using only her sense of touch and muscle memory developed through countless repetitions, she had rendered an entire squad's equipment inoperable in under 2 minutes. The escape through hostile territory required every skill she possessed: navigation by starlight, evasion of patrol units, survival in desert conditions with minimal supplies. But she had made it to the extraction point with intelligence that would protect American soldiers for decades to come. Back in the Fort Bragg maintenance bay, Morrison and Collins stood in silence, processing the magnitude of what had been accomplished. The woman they had initially dismissed as support staff had successfully completed one of the most dangerous intelligence operations in recent military history. "You know what the really incredible part is?" Collins said finally. Morrison looked questioningly. "We almost didn't believe her. We almost dismissed her just like everyone else did. If she hadn't demonstrated those skills, if she hadn't shown us what was possible." Morrison nodded slowly. "We would have missed the whole point. We would have seen what we expected to see instead of what was actually there." The lesson wasn't lost on either of them. In a world where assumptions could be deadly, where first impressions could blind you to extraordinary reality, the ability to recognize exceptional capability regardless of its packaging was itself a survival skill. Over the following months, Morrison found himself sharing Maria's story with other soldiers, always emphasizing the same point. Extraordinary people rarely look the way you expect them to look. They don't announce themselves with fanfare or demand recognition for their capabilities. They simply perform at levels that redefine what you thought was possible. The Syrian weapons facility had indeed been destroyed, but not by airstrikes or special operations raids. It had been destroyed by the sabotage that Maria had introduced into their production processes. When their reverse-engineered weapons began failing catastrophically during field testing, killing several technicians and destroying expensive equipment, the entire program had been abandoned as too dangerous to continue. Similar failures began occurring at the other facilities that Maria had identified as intelligence assets introduced comparable sabotage based on her techniques. Within a year, the global threat from reverse-engineered American weapons had been effectively neutralized, not through military action, but through technical expertise applied with surgical precision. Collins eventually became one of the Army's most skilled weapons technicians, driven by the memory of what he had witnessed in that maintenance bay. Morrison advanced to Master Sergeant and began teaching advanced weapons maintenance courses, always emphasizing that technical excellence wasn't just about mechanical skills. It was about being ready to perform the impossible when ordinary solutions weren't enough. And sometimes, late at night, when the base was quiet and the maintenance bay was empty, Morrison would practice his own rifle disassembly, pushing himself to move faster, to work more precisely, to develop the kind of muscle memory that could function under any conditions. He never achieved Maria's 8-second standard, but he understood now that the pursuit of impossible excellence was itself valuable, regardless of whether you ever reached the destination. Because somewhere in the world, exceptional people were undertaking impossible missions to protect the things that mattered, and the least he could do was be ready to support them, to understand them, and to never again make the mistake of judging capability by appearance. They had called her support staff, but she had supported something far more important than any of them had initially understood.
She had supported the security and safety of everyone who depended on American military excellence. And that, Morrison realized, was what true support looked like. Coming up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.